me. So as I said, this is the outline of what we're going to do, and the slide that we passed by, it oriented this work has its home at NCI in our Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences in the Healthcare Delivery Research Program, all of which is relevant to understanding the intentions and the hopes for the research that we would like to, that we're soliciting by putting out this announcement. And then you've gone down to slide 4, which is fine, and if you look, you are able to submit questions at any time, as you already heard. And then it's tempting, I know, of course, you're all thinking about your own specific interests, your research plans, your applications that maybe you've submitted or are planning to submit. But if you would just hold those specific questions, you're welcome to contact me at any time. You can see my email address there, and we can discuss specific questions. The one caveat I would say is that if you have a question that is not just about the framing of your own work, any question that occurs to you that you're uncertain how to make fit is probably a question that someone else will have as well. So if you can frame it in a more general way, please don't hesitate to do that. Okay, then we're moving, there's an introduction that we're having a background slide, and then we move on to slide 6. This is, as I was describing to you, where the research is situated. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the implementation science focus that comes out of our division. They're a team, they sit just down the hall from us. We are the yellow box, the Healthcare Delivery Research Program. We work closely with them as well as with the other programs that are within the division. And I'm happy to talk with you about study sections as you go forward and thinking about how the aims of a project help you choose where you would get the best review. On to the next slide, which is slide 7. This is within the context of our Healthcare Delivery Research Program. We have 3 different branches. And one is the Healthcare Assessment Branch, which we very colloquially call HARB because it's Healthcare Assessment Research Branch. They do a lot of population level measurement and evaluation. And then you see health systems and interventions research is depicted as being in that inner ring, the light blue ring. We are focused on both observational and interventional research to help us understand behavior and the context in which behavior in the healthcare system takes place. So understanding that physicians are people who behave and administrators are people who have behaviors. We're trying to see, to study and to promote research on the understanding of how all of those different components of the delivery system can interact with each other. And the Outcomes Research Branch evaluates and improves patient experiences. They are very focused on the development of high quality, well-validated measures of patient-reported outcomes. On to slide 8. The first bullet here is one of the most important points, which is that our portfolio at NIH, this is true across NIH, not just NCI, is still predominated by investigator-initiated, or what we used to call unsolicited or grants. And so we're here to talk about an announcement of interest that comes from us, but we certainly recognize that many of the best ideas for research don't come from inside NIH, but come from the researchers around the country. And when an idea comes in for review that is not in response to an announcement, we still call that investigator-initiated or unsolicited. That term comes from prior to electronic submission. So in the age of electronic submission, where there's a box into which you must put an announcement number, it's easy to think that everything is in response to an announcement. But in fact, those parent announcements for R01s, for R03s, are still the ones that receive the largest number of applications. And it's just it's an umbrella term so that you're able to use electronic submission, but still to have your own ideas. That said, there are different ways that we describe our specific areas of interest. There are RFAs, which are generally time limited, but do have money set aside for them, often just one submission date, and their own separate review group. In the past, we had many program announcements, and you notice that it is crossed out because right now, NCI is no longer publishing anything that is called a program announcement. In the past, those were simple statements of research interest. All the regular standing submission dates were used, and the normal peer review process of assigning to the standing study sections were used. There was no money set aside and no separate review panel or criteria. Those program announcements, for now, have been stopped. And in their place is something that we call a NOSI, or a Notice of Special Interest. It is meant to be a shorter process on our side to get approval to publish a NOSI, with the understanding to the research community that, again, it's a statement of a particular area of interest that we'd like to solicit applications. There will be no money set aside. There will be no separate study section. It's a Notice of Special Interest. Happy to talk about that some more. The last example here, the last type of announcement that we make is a PAR, so a program announcement with some kind of special R. And that R might stand for separate receipt dates, a separate review committee, separate review criteria. I think the referral is meant on this slide to mean a SEP or a special emphasis panel that's put together specifically to review the announcement. This announcement, the HPV vaccine PAR that we're talking about, was originally conceived as having standard receipt dates, a special emphasis panel, and separate review criteria, so 2 of the R's that made it an R. Unfortunately, when the announcement was reissued, or fortunately, we'll find out, we're going to be collecting data to understand the implications. While it is still true that there are separate review considerations, it is no longer true that there is going to be a SEP or a special emphasis panel that is brought together just for the purposes of reviewing these grants. And that has lots of implications that I will be glad to discuss with you in the question and answer section. Moving on to the next slide, just a little more general information about the grant mechanisms. All 3 of these are involved in this PAR, the R01, the R21, and the R03. There's a description on these slides. Generally speaking, one can think of the R01 as sort of the primary investigator driven. You can see the second bullet says it's most common. There is no specific dollar limit. They range from 3 to 5 years in their research period. There are caps to costs, but not really caps. You just have to have extra approvals if you go above the $500,000 a year. Many people will be familiar that there's also something called a modular R01, which is smaller, and I'd be happy to talk about how to use that if anyone has questions. In the middle is the shorter R21, which is meant for exploratory and developmental work specifically, and the smallest grant program is the R03, which is shortest, smallest amount of funding, although also can be 2 years, similar to the R21. The red note in the bottom tells you that, whereas I mentioned a moment ago, the parent announcements, so that investigator-initiated work can come in these 3 different sizes. There is a parent R01 and there is a parent R03. Presently, NCI is not participating in a parent R21. So that means if you have a exploratory or developmental idea that fits best with this budget amount and this amount of time, it needs to be only R21 applications that can come in must be in response to a PAR like the one we're talking about today, or an RFA. Okay, let's move on to the next. We're now going to talk specifically about this funding opportunity, and then we can go to slide 11 to remind everyone, I'm sure that you have read it, but the purpose of this PAR is specifically to think about how the healthcare delivery system enhances or inhibits, and it's important that it is bidirectional there, the effectiveness of that recommendation that the provider makes, so the effectiveness of the recommendation for adolescent HPV vaccine. Many of you are familiar that there's a strong body of literature that the provider's recommendation is very important for increasing all kinds of health behavior changes, from smoking cessation to cancer screening, certainly, and even weight loss and physical activity, that if your doctor tells you to do it, it has more effect than many other intervention approaches or other aspects of the system. So the question here is, what we know that about the provider recommendation, that it's very important. The purpose of this PAR is to understand how all the characteristics of the setting around the provider can enhance or inhibit the success of that recommendation, that is, whether or not it results in uptake. And specifically, the announcement requests that there is study of the characteristics of the provider, of either the parent or the patient, or of course both, and of the clinical setting itself, and all 3 of those levels are required. The final bullet, or the final statement, is that the research requires expertise across a wide range of domains, which I'm sure you all are well aware. HPV vaccine is a different kind of cancer prevention than we have been accustomed to studying, or at least that was true 15 years ago, and we're all getting caught up on it. Okay, on to slide 12, please. These are the three effectively, sort of research questions not framed as a question, or the types of studies that we're interested in. So identifying the characteristics at those three levels that might have the effect of enhancing or inhibiting uptake. And the announcement does specify the primary age recommendation of 11 to 12-year-olds. To identify the mechanisms by which these characteristics operate. Again, as I said, bidirectionally, that might they help or hurt actually getting from the provider recommendation to vaccine uptake. And the third bullet is developing and testing interventions that would target characteristics at two or more of these levels. So you can roughly think of these three statements as mapping to the three types of mechanisms. One might use an R03 to do small research that identifies characteristics. One might do an R21-like, more expensive but still brief examination of how those mechanisms have their effect. And presumably an R01 would be needed to develop and test interventions, but they're not, it's not required that these questions map to the mechanisms. There are ways to do larger or smaller pieces of all of them, except perhaps test interventions using the different mechanisms. Please move on to slide 13. These are the key components of all of the research that is funded through this announcement and what we're hoping that people will include. The first is that primary data has to be collected in the clinical setting where the vaccine is, primary data need to be collected in the clinical setting where the vaccine is both able to be recommended and also to be administered to adolescents. The focus should be on both boys and girls unless there's some compelling scientific reason for excluding one of the groups. And there should be a focus on opportunities to close, to close disparities. So the idea is not only to focus on the primary age for the primary recommendation, but also explicitly to work in areas of the country where uptake of the first dose of HPV vaccine is lower than the national average. And generally, all of the research and response to this announcement is asked to consider and measure characteristics at all three levels. Some of the language that we have used over time, consider and measure means to have some hypotheses about the interplay across the levels, which doesn't necessitate intervention at all of the levels for a small grant like an R03, but it does require thinking about how, even without intervention, how the behavior of one of the levels, say a parent, might affect some outcome of interest or process of interest in the clinic setting, say the behavior of the practice nurse who's going to give the vaccine, or the reverse, how the practice nurse might affect parent attitudes or so on. So need not be statistical interaction that the study is powered for, but a conceptual focus on how the different levels might affect each other, and then deliberate measurement of some of those hypotheses. On to number 14, please, slide 14. These are the new numbers for the reissued FOAs. All three mechanisms are described here. They all have a 19 number now, so that's how you'll know you have the right announcement. If you just Google linking the provider recommendation, you will find one of these announcements, and as long as you attend to the dates, you'll see that they all include links. So if you happen to land on an older one, you should look closely to see whether it says there is an updated version of this announcement, because if you find a PAR number that has a 16 or an 18, it will link to the correct one. So just attend closely when you see what you're reading to the dates and the numbers that are there, but it should not be hard to find the correct ones. They are due on the regular submission dates. There's no letter of intent due. The earliest start date has already passed, so that is all standard, and the current announcement is expected to expire in July of 22. And I'm sure you all know that registering in all of these systems that the NIH uses to accept applications takes a long time. So if you're new to this, please get started on that process early. If you continue to slide 15, it simply tells you that the conversation, the slides that I've just shown you, the descriptions of them, and then our discussion that I hope is about to ensue of people's questions, as well as a general presentation of some frequently asked questions are on our website and available to you at any time. And please feel free to write to me if you want to talk about more specific details. And I think that's it. If you go to the next slide, it has our Twitter information and ways to stay connected with the Healthcare Delivery Research Program at NCI. And now we can go to our invitation to questions on slide 17. Stephanie, should I look to the questions document that I know some have already come in?
Yes, again, if anyone has any questions that you've come up with throughout this presentation, please go ahead and submit those in the Q&A or the chat box at this time.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for that great presentation. We do have a few questions that came in, so thank you to our participants for submitting questions. And Sarah, the first question is, the FOA indicates that it will not support research projects that rely solely on patient and provider communications exclusively. What exactly does that mean? And specifically, if one were to propose a trial that compared different methods of dissemination and a provider-patient communication intervention that has a strong evidence base, would this be of interest?
So, Veronica, thank you for reading the question. And excuse me. You know, really the core of this announcement is to understand how the provider's recommendation is affected by all of the characteristics of the patients, the providers, and the system to become, to produce the job, the actual vaccine uptake. So it's not meant to be studying only patient and provider communication. A trial that compared different methods of disseminating the communication intervention would be interesting to the extent that there are hypotheses and measures about the characteristics of the different settings, including the clinic practices, the clinicians and non-clinician staff in the clinic, and the patient or parent, how those affect the success of the intervention. So if that were the case, yes, I could certainly see that being framed that way. The intervention can be directed at a smaller piece of the whole system, including the patient-provider communication. I hope that's helpful. If the person who sent that question would like more of an answer, please put something in the suggestion box, comment box.
Okay. The next question we have is, will the intervention at alternate provider settings, such as dental offices, be eligible to apply for this program?
So any provider setting where two things are true, one is that the recommendation can be made, and the second is that the vaccine could actually be given. And so I understand that a number of dental offices, a lot of dental providers, dentists, have been interested in being part of this anti-cancer message and pro-vaccine. And studying them would be welcome as long as it's also true that they have the ability to give the vaccine. And my understanding of dentists is that for some of those practices, the actual delivery of the vaccine has turned out to be challenging. So only if those two criteria are met would the other alternate provider be appropriate. But if they are both there, it would be fascinating. So.
The next question is, are there citizenship and green card requirements for PIs for these FOAs?
The requirements for PIs for these FOAs are not any different from other existing NIH announcements. Frequently for RFAs where money is set aside, it is the case that investigators from outside of the U.S. are not eligible, but that's not the case for most published announcements in the guide other than RFAs. So I believe that no, there is no such requirement.
Okay. Given that there are no longer a special review group, do you have suggested study sections that might align with this PAR?
Yeah, I think that's the question of the day. Well, I have two thoughts. One is that it's always the case that before you pick a study section, you need to look closely at your aims and your outcome measures. The outcome measures, I think, are really the most telling thing, because a study section will be expecting certain kinds of analyses, certain kinds of measures, and their expectations are framed by the focus of the study section and also the expertise of the standing reviewers. And so, you might frame a project that is responsive to this announcement in a more dissemination implementation way, or you might frame it more in an intervention efficacy way, and those would need to go to different study sections. So for individual details, I'm glad to talk with you. I'm sure Veronica is also glad to talk with people about choosing a study section, and we would not want to think about that until you really have your aims and your outcome measures pretty well fixed, and then it makes sense to talk about matching expertise. That's one piece of information. The second is that the SRO, the study review officer, who's the NIH doctorally trained scientist who runs each of the study sections, the woman who was running the PAR that we had, the SEP, the small extra separate review committee that we did have for the first 3 years of this, she is in charge of CIHB, Community Influences on Health Behavior. And so you might consider looking at that study section, even if you don't think that the description of the study section is exactly aligned with what you're proposing to do. Her expertise in this announcement is very deep, and her list of appropriate reviewers that she could call upon is also very long, and she and I have collaborated well together. So I think that, give serious consideration to requesting CIHB if you think there's any way that it might be even, close. Don't dismiss it, because, as I said, she herself embodies an awful lot of expertise in reviewing these applications. She understands the announcement. She understands the separate review criteria. Although it is the case that any study section that reviews a PAR that has separate review criteria is asked to consider those review criteria, I expect it to be a less direct link between the review criteria and the review than there was in the SEP.
Thanks, Sarah. The next question is, I am an early career investigator. With regard to the R03 involving secondary analysis of existing data, an impediment that could occur is that a significant proportion of the funding dollar will go into purchase of these data. Any advice on this?
Yeah, it sounds like that what comes, the assumption under the question is that there are some large external data sets that have to be purchased. And I think our focus on this R03 was more the possibility that data exist relating to a specific clinical setting. So I'm not sure what would be large data that would be purchased that would be relevant to a specific clinical setting with low uptake. If the person who had that question, wants to talk with me separately, I'd be glad to do that in case I'm not understanding what you're saying. Or if you would like to speak up, you could ask to be unmuted in the chat box.
If you can share, I'm curious why applications responding to this PAR no longer will be reviewed by a special emphasis panel.
Yeah, it's a decision that was made many pay grades above mine, above my boss, above his boss, sufficiently above that all of our impassioned requests for it to be different were rejected. And I think it simply has to do with the number of separate review panels that were being requested across NIH and the burden on the Center for Scientific Review to manage all of those separate and small, relatively small panels for specific areas of study. They believe, and I know that they are well-intentioned and are going to do their best, but they're able to review the science from each of these separate announcements in thoughtful and effective ways with the existing panels that they have and bringing in extra reviewers with content expertise. Our announcement routinely would have, the smallest maybe once was 3 or 4, and the largest ever was 13 or 15 applications in a single round. And so the panel would be assembled to meet by telephone. And it's a lot of work for an SRO to set up a meeting and set up all the systems and all the support people versus the standing panels, which have 120 or so applications that they're able to do in 2 days. And the hope is that the review can be done by folding the expertise into those standing panels. So what I would say is that I want these applications to have the best and most well-informed review possible, so that as we go forward, if you have any information about your review experience and who was brought into a panel, you know, I recognize it's not ideal for you to provide information to us about things that don't go perfectly, but please do tell me if anything goes a way you think was not the best for your application. And, you know, talk with me before you submit, which is the time when I can engage with the study section. Once you have submitted, you can speak only with the SRO. I'm not supposed to get involved after that. So before you submit, talk with me about the expertise that you see is needed for your application, and I can be a conduit. You can also write directly to the SRO after you've submitted and your application has been assigned, and describe the expertise only that you think is needed. So be very precise about it, be very specific about it. Expertise is needed in this kind of clinical care delivery setting, in adolescent attitudes, in whatever, you know, is the very specific expertise that's needed in order to understand what you're proposing. Don't hesitate to tell that to the SRO. Don't say names. If you say the name of a particular person who you think would be a good reviewer, that person will immediately be excluded as in conflict. So don't say names. And the flip side of that is if you think there is someone already, either already on the panel as a standing member, or you just know of somebody who has a grudge against you, who you specifically don't want to have review, you can give names in that case. The expectation is it would never be more than 1 or 2 at the most, and then you'd have a strong explanation for why that person should not be asked to review your application. I think that's more of an exceptional thing than a normative thing, but it is in your power to do that.
So the next question is related to clarifying application due dates. Is the R01 due March the 5th, 2020? And is the R03 and R21 due February 16, 2020?
So I could do what you all can do, which is go and open the announcements to confirm. I don't have these in my head, but it's really easy to do. If you go and Google linking the provider recommendation, I'm now doing that. I notice the first thing that comes up is still the 2016 one, so I'm going to the second one that has a 19. The R03 is what came up first for some reason, but I'm going to go to the R01. And then I scroll down to key dates, and there are application due dates. It says standard dates apply. Standard dates is an active link, so you can go to the active links. For NIH standard due dates, scroll down to the R01, new research grants, February 5, June 5, October 5. R03 and R21, February 16, June 16, October 16. Those are the standard due dates. And then down below that is R01 renewal, and similarly R03 or R21 renewal dates, and those are somewhat different. So you should be able to easily find the standard due dates for NIH, and that's what we are following.
Okay, another question is, how about community clinics that are co-located with dental offices, where the dentist would not be providing the vaccine but could recommend and refer to the clinic?
I think that the clinics are sufficiently integrated with each other that the recommendation from the dentist could produce vaccination, you know, that day during that visit. If, you know, you're stressing my my thoughts as they exist so far about what it means to be a site where both could take place. I think that is what the announcement requires, is that the practice site has to be a place where both the recommendation and the vaccination can take place.
What is stated that alternative settings where vaccine is not given cannot be eligible? For example, dentists can recommend but not give vaccines, so dental settings are not appropriate for this RFA?
Yeah, it's stated that those two requirements are in place. It has to be a place where both the vaccine can be recommended and given.
And we just have one last question. Any preference for survey type research versus intervention trials?
No, I mean, all three of the questions that I went through as essential to this science are of interest. And just to go back, let's see, it's slide 12, if you want to put that back up. You know, these are three different components of the overall issue that we're interested in. And so the first is identifying the characteristics that might be influential, whether they enhance or inhibit. The second is the mechanisms, what makes these characteristics have the effect that they have. And perhaps in what context do they have one effect or another. And then the third is developing and testing interventions. So, you know, and all three of those are of interest. Primary data have to be collected in a clinical setting where the recommendation and the vaccination can be done. And otherwise, you know, no preference. The question is only to match the right method to the question that you're interested in answering. As long as it's a question of priority, then agnostic to your approach. We do describe some preference for innovative methods. So if there were a combination of survey and observation, or, you know, how are you going to get at it? What can you learn by surveying that is a contribution to understanding how this whole process works? Happy to talk to whoever answered the question separately if you would like.
Well, since there are no more questions, I'll turn it back over to Stephanie.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining today. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be posted online at a later date. If you did think of or if you have any questions that you come up with in the next couple of days, feel free to reach out to Sarah. Her email is again here at the beginning of the presentation. And we will be able to follow up on email if you have any further questions, if you didn't get them answered today, so on and so forth. So thank you again for your time. We will be ending this webinar now, and you can look for it online in the near future. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.